So let's just go through, since we're all kind of going to be talking today, the four of us will just do quick introductions. So my name is Annie Cladd. I'm at University of Minnesota, and I'm the statewide extension educator for fruit crops. So I spend a significant portion of my time with grape growers. Amaya, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Amaya Tucha. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Horticulture at UW-Madison, and I'm also the fruit crop specialist for the state of Wisconsin. And I work with all fruit crops, but I spend a lot of my time working with grape growers.
Leslie?
All right, so I'm Christelle Guido. I'm the fruit crop entomologist and extension specialist and associate professor in the Department of Entomology at UW-Madison. So same than Amaya and Leslie, I cover all the fruit crops in Wisconsin and insects, pests, and pollinators. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Holland, and I work on the pathology side for all fruit crops, as Christelle and Amaya have mentioned, for Wisconsin.
Okay, great. All right, it looks like we have a good group today. We have about 30 or so grape growers on the call, so thanks for joining us. So we wanted to there's a few things we wanted to talk about today, but maybe we should start the discussion with just some canopy management topics. So Amaya, you said you were out in the vineyard recently, right? What are things looking like?
Well, with the recent rain that we've received, I feel like we are at that point in which vines that tend to be in bigger size are just like exploding. And just like we're seeing a lot of shoot growth, a lot of vegetation. And so in some of those high cordon is probably the time where you are already starting to see some of the shoots trailing down on the alleyway, and might be, that time of thinking about the first skirting, if you're skirting. If you are on a VSP, it also is probably the time where you can already see that your shoots are all the way up to the top wire on the trellis, and maybe some of them in the most bigger size are already flipping over the top wire, and so that would be another indication when those shoots are all the way up there and they're folding on top of your fruit zone. It might be an indication that you would want to hedge those shoots. So that's where we are at here. We haven't. I think we're probably in southern Wisconsin, maybe 2 weeks to 3 weeks, depending on the weather, from hitting the raisin. So berries are expanding, but they're still pretty green and hard.
Okay. And yeah, it's not too different. I don't have anything too unique to say for what's going on in Minnesota. That sounds pretty similar, because just like you guys, we still are in a drought, but we went for, I think, 3 weeks without any rain at all. And then a lot of Minnesota did have a rain last weekend, and it rained for most of the state again yesterday. So we have had some recent rains, which are much needed. But I think growth was fairly slow for a while there, especially for newly planted vines. And so I think, especially for those new vineyards, we're thankful to have some water here recently. So Amaya, you had mentioned hedging. Let's start with that. So when do you recommend that growers begin hedging, whether it be maybe VSP and high cordon? At what point should you hedge, and when might you be hedging too much or too often?
Okay, so one of the things that we need to remember is that those leaves on those shoots are there for a reason. And the reason is that those leaves are the ones that are producing photosynthesis, and they're producing carbohydrates that are the sugars needed to ripe those grapes. Okay, so that is why we have the leaves and the importance of having healthy foliage. And I know that Leslie and Christelle will talk a little bit about diseases and insects that could affect that, but that's the reason why we want to keep those leaves. So one thing to remember is that research shows clearly that you need at least 16 healthy leaves per shoot to be able to ripe 2 clusters in that shoot. So you need to keep that in mind when you're hedging. If you hedge too much and you are keeping those shoots really short and you don't have enough leaves, then what you're going to do is you're going to delay fruit ripening and possibly never get to those bricks that you want to harvest that fruit. So that's one thing. So we want to hedge. When do we want to hedge? We want to hedge when those shoots, if you're in a VSP, so if your shoots are growing a vertical position up, they are bending over the top wire and they're starting to shade those other leaves. So you're getting kind of like a double curtain. You have your shoot going up and then it bends and then you have another layer. When you're getting to that point, you want to hedge because you want those leaves not only to be healthy, but also to receive enough light to produce photosynthesis. So that is a good, that would be for me like the point where I would decide to start hedging, when I can see that those shoots in the VSP are going all the way up and just flipping over and shading the shoot. For the high cordon, if you're in a high cordon, the same is true. You still need those 16 leaves to be healthy and totally expanded to be able to ripe those two clusters. I usually hedge, and in the vineyards, in the research vineyards, we usually skirt. Those means to cut those shoots that are going down when they start trailing into the alleyway. Okay, that's when I want to start skirting. I'm more of the theory of try to hedge and skirt as minimal as possible, only when needed, because every time you do that, what you ended up having is, especially on cultivars that are very, very, very vigorous, Marquette, we all know about Marquette, is that you're going to get all these laterals that are going to start breaking because you are breaking off some of that apical dominance. And so every time you're cutting it, you're going to have more of those lateral shoots coming out and then more vegetation and more shade within your canopy. So skirting or hedging only when needed. Don't go overboard with it, and always remember that you need those leaves to be able to ripe those clusters. Without those leaves, you're going to delay or you're never going to get to the brick level that you want.
Thanks, Amaya. Great answer. And
I'll add something to that. This is Christelle. So thinking about insects, right? If you have Japanese beetle that are defoliating your leaves, then you're better off leaving more than 16 leaves so that you can have some for the Japanese beetle, potentially for phylloxera or something like that, that could damage your leaves, so that you have, like Amaya said, the minimum, but you also have like room for feeding insects that you won't see as major damage, because you have those minimum leaves that you need to ripen your clusters. So something to think about too.
Yeah, and that's a great point as well. And one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure we did this question and kind of highlighted this question today is I have had 2 or 3 growers, in the last week or so, ask me if they could cut off the shoots above the fruiting zone, because they don't like the look of the large canopy on a high cordon vine drooping over into the rows. But that's what grapevines do. That's how they're supposed to look. And so it's just really important that people don't feel tempted to cut off too much, especially for the sake of aesthetics. Definitely not worth it. And the research that Amaya is referring to, there's actually been studies at Cornell to address this, where they did heavy summer pruning like that, and they defoliated the vines, and they really saw those differences in ripening, and they saw that the vines had a really hard time making it through the winter. So, yep. Thank you for Amaya and Christelle for contributing to that discussion. Okay, so what was the next thing we wanted to talk about? Aerial roots.
Can
Yes.
we
Maybe,
answer one of the questions that we have
Sure.
here on the Q&A, that given that it's about canopy management?
Yep.
Too late to leaf pull? Actually, no. Perfect timing. At least here in southern Wisconsin, I know if you are in the northern part of the state, or if you're in Minnesota, you might be delayed for a week from what we're saying here, that we're a little bit warmer. Perfect timing for leaf pulling right now. We just did it in our research vineyards last week. This is the time. This is the time where you still have those berries that are small enough. They've been, if you leaf pull right now, those skins on those berries are going to thicken and they're going to grow well exposed to the sunlight, so they won't have any sunburn. So this is the time to remove those 2 to 3 maximum leaves around the clusters to open up the canopy for more light exposure. You don't want to do it after veraison, after the grapes start turning color, because that's when you're probably going to get some sunburn.
All right, so let's go on to one of the pictures that we wanted to highlight. And this is actually, can you see that? Can you see the photo? Okay.
Yeah.
And this is actually one of my photos. You know, we asked growers to submit photos for this, but we didn't actually get too many. So we're sharing some of our own photos of related to questions that we often get this time of year. And so one of them is this, what you see in this picture, and often the question I get is, what are these roots doing here? So this is at the bottom of the photo, this is the cordon, and these are coming off of the spur. These are called aerial roots. So they actually are technically root structures on the grapevine, but they're coming out of the canopy. And Dr. Eric Staffney down at Mississippi State University did a study on aerial roots a few years back. And I think what he was finding was basically aerial roots are going to be more common on vines that are stressed, and they're going to be more common in vines that are in high humidity or high moisture environments. The aerial roots in themselves are not going to do any damage to the vine. I just like to describe them to growers as like, this is a sign that your vines may be in an environment that they're not 100% happy with. They're stressed or they're getting too much moisture. And so this is something that you do want to look for, because it's just a sign that your vines are trying to tell you something, basically. Amaya, did you have something else you wanted to add on that?
No, I know that there's been some, theory. I don't know if there's any research that suggests that aerial roots might also be produced when there's cold damage, a lot of damage. That's another thing. But I think that you're spot on with saying, like, if you see these, it might be that there's some sort of stress, whether it's too much humidity or something that is making those vines unhappy, and that's why they're kind of like, their way of reacting to that stress is to put out those aerial roots. I've seen them every year in the vineyard, and a lot of the shoots, actually, those aerial roots will dry up in the winter, and some of those shoots will just be just fine the next year when you spur them, and that's it. Nothing happened. It's not that the vines are going to die or you're going to lose your shoots or your spurs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Okay, and so I don't have anything to add on aerial roots. If people have follow-up questions on that, feel free to type them in the Q&A. But we want to get on to, I think this is the last question for, overall, vine management. And then we're going to go into diseases and insect pests. But let's talk about nutrition and petiole analysis. And I would just start by saying that if you're just doing routine petiole analysis, the important times to do that are during bloom and veraison. And so, Amaya, can you talk a little bit more about that as growers are thinking towards veraison and they need to do petiole analysis?
Yeah, so I think, a lot of the growers know that there are, but we can review this again. There are 2 timings for those petiole samples. It's a bloom time or during midsummer. It's the 2 times where we say, like, around veraison is the time. So we obviously already passed the bloom time. And so now if you want to sample, you can do it by veraison. What I tell growers is, like, be consistent with everything. Be consistent with the lab that you're using. Be consistent with the time of the year, because you will not have the same range of normal range for each nutrient, depending if you're sampling during bloom or during veraison. So it's easier to just stick with one and every year do the same one. When we're going to sample for petiole analysis during midsummer at veraison, what you want to do is you want to sample from anywhere between the 5th or the 7th leaves from the tip all the way towards the base of the shoot that is fully expanded. those are the leaves that you want to collect with the pestile, and then separate the pestile from the blade of the leaf, and then put them all and send it to the lab. So we've written so many articles about it, between the ones in the Wisconsin Fruit News and the ones that Annie puts in the Fruit and Vegetable newsletter in Minnesota. I'm sure that another one will be coming out just to remind them all, but keep in mind that within the next maybe 2 to 3 weeks, that is going to be the time when you start seeing varieties to collect for pestile analysis. And this is something that I cannot stress enough. Every year, this is a way of checking. It's like when you go to the doctor and you do your annual visit to the doctor. This is the way that you can see how things are changing, how nutrients are changing, whether you are coming into a nutrient deficiency, or if you over fertilize it with something. This is where you see the trends. So having every year do the pestile analysis at the same time with the same lab, it's really important to see long-term trends in the vineyard. Annie, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to say about the sampling.
Yeah, sure. So I just shared a link in the chat, and that is the webpage that we created over the last year that goes through how to do both tissue and soil nutrient testing for cold climate vineyards. And I believe it includes the videos that we have done on that as well. And so I'm going to just share my screen again. If you were to go to that link and open up this webpage, this is what you're going to see. And if you just scroll down, the thing that I want to highlight is, everyone can send in their samples and they get their report back. And then the question is, how do I interpret this report and actually use it to inform the decisions I make in the vineyard? And so when you get those numbers on the report, the key is to compare them to something. Compare them to the established, sufficiency levels or optimal levels of nutrients in those vines. And so there has been research that has gone into this. Several Midwest states, including Minnesota. I don't know if Wisconsin was involved in this back in 2015-16. Yes, okay. To determine what those optimal levels are. And so these are the optimal levels that you can compare your tissue test results to. And when you get your report back, depending on what lab you go with, sometimes they try to interpret those numbers as well. And so sometimes in the report, you'll see like low, medium, high, or excessive on the report, but those numbers are not always consistent with what the research in the Midwest has found. They might be comparing them to Norway or California or the Finger Lakes, and that doesn't necessarily translate to us here in the Midwest. And so we really recommend using the numbers that were from research done here. So take advantage of that resource that I shared in the chat. Okay, so Christelle, do we want to move into some insect questions?
Sure.
Is there anything in particular you would like to tackle first, or would you like me to lead in?
No, so what I would say at this time of the year in grape, as you probably have all noticed for the most part, is Japanese beetle is what we started seeing in the last couple of weeks, and really much more in the last week or so. So that's not surprising. I think everybody has heard all of us talk about that and what you need to do. Again, going back to the leaves and the pruning and all that you may be doing, you can tolerate a lot of damage from Japanese beetle. We're talking about approximately a 30% defoliation on the entire plant before you would possibly even see damage, because the research has not shown any impact on the plant growth with 30% defoliation. So you can tolerate a lot. Again, if you only need 16 leaves for 2 clusters to ripen, you can imagine that you have way more than that in most of your cultivars. And so you can give some to Japanese beetle. They're providing you with free pruning pretty much. So think about it that way. And when you're trying to estimate this defoliation, you do not want to focus on those leaves that look completely skeletonized. You want to be looking at the entire plant, right? We're talking about an entire plant having 30% of damage. And so please refer back to webinars that we've had in the past where I discussed that, but you really want to take an approach of the whole plant. Another thing that I wanted to talk about at this time would be a rose chafer. So maybe I can show you some pictures. I'll share my screen quick.
Oh, we
So
can see all your files and stuff.
I know
All right.
you have to open it because it's okay. So rose chafer. So this is a picture of rose chafer damage, right? So if you see this, that looks very much like Japanese beetle. This is a pretty decent looking defoliation, and the leaf is pretty much, completely dried up. But I just want to point out that they will look similar to Japanese beetle. And then what was I going to say? As far as the defoliation, again, it would be, I think it would be this one, right? When you're looking at this kind of damage, if you focus on leaves that are highly defoliated, like the one I just showed you before, for rose chafer, you might be worried. Consider the whole plant. And then I wanted to show you a picture of a rose chafer, just so you can see what it looks like compared to a Japanese beetle, right? We all know what a Japanese beetle looks like. Rose chafer are pretty big. They, in comparison to Japanese beetle, similar in size, I would say, but they have these long brown dangling legs. They don't cause tremendous damage. They will defoliate the same way. They're not going to be active for the whole entire season either. They're more in sandy soil. That's where they lay their eggs. So sandy soil vineyards will have more of a problem with rose chafer, but similar damage than Japanese beetle. So you can again tolerate quite a bit of defoliation. So that's what I wanted to say about what you would be seeing at this time of year that you would want to pay attention to. And then there's phylloxera that you're still probably seeing. The galls are still here, but you're pretty much at the end of the windows for managing them. There's no point in really going any further with management for phylloxera from now on. And really, again, that goes back to your leaves. So what are you seeing when you have phylloxera galls like this? You have your leaf that's fully expanded. You don't have any issues. So these leaves are pretty very typical of a grape phylloxera. If you have your leaf that's fully expanded, again, the leaf is still doing what it needs to do. It's still providing the photosynthesis that is needed to ripen your clusters. But if you have a heavy infestation, and of course now I won't find it because I didn't label it, did I? Oh, I wanted to point out with this picture that sometimes those galls look red on the phylloxera. That might be looking like grape two-milled gall maker, but I don't need to go into that as far as like comparing them at this time of the year. But earlier in the season, if you see those galls that are red, it could be grape two-milled gall maker, which will look different and will look something like this, that can look like a grape phylloxera, but then if you look at them closer, they're smooth and they're different. Whereas the grape phylloxera are more like this wart-looking galls that you see. Also, grape two-milled gall maker can do this on the stems. And then I can't find, but you can see what. Oh, here it is. That's this one. So that's when you have a problem with grape phylloxera, right? When you have so many galls that the leaf curls up. So that's what you want to be paying attention to. But at this time of the year, you might do a last spray and then you're pretty much done for grape phylloxera. That's all I had for this.
Thanks, Christelle. So I got a photo from somebody, I think it was this morning or yesterday, of leaves inside a grow tube that were decently defoliated. I'm just gonna share that photo and see if you know what is causing this damage. Can you tell, Christelle, from that photo if this is Japanese beetle or something else? I followed up with him to ask if he saw any Japanese beetles around, but I haven't gotten an answer yet.
I mean, that it's hard to tell because the leaf is also all curled up, but that could definitely be Japanese beetle. I mean, they feed between the leaves, and that's the veins. I mean, and that they do not feed as opposite to apple leaves. They don't feed on the surface of the leaves. They cut through the leaves. But there's other insects that do that, right? The fact that they go between the veins could be rose chafer, could be Japanese beetle, but the most likely culprit in our vineyard in the region is Japanese beetle. So I would suspect it's not going to be something like a cutworm or something like that, because they would just do chunks on the side of a leaf, you know, like a moth caterpillar. But this kind of damage, I would suspect is Japanese beetle. Yeah.
Okay, and then do you have any suggestions then for somebody who has grow tubes on the vines and needs to control Japanese beetles? Do they spray down into their grow tubes or what?
So the leaf was in there?
Oh yeah, all of these leaves were growing inside the tube.
Oh, and is that a sandy soil?
Oh, I don't know if it was sandy soil. I got very minimal information
Yeah.
from the person who asked the question.
Well, yeah, I mean, but you're not going to spray if you don't see any Japanese beetle, right? So that would be first we need to know, make sure that they have the insect in question.
Well, let's say there are people who do have Japanese beetles present. So in that case, not this particular grower necessarily, but if they do have Japanese beetles present and it's damaging the new vines inside the grow tube.
But you need to protect those new vines. There's no doubt that you need to protect them. So rose chafer, you really need to protect those new vines as well. So yes, I would say you need to apply something to protect those vines.
But should they spray directly down into the tube, or how do
That's
they
a good
handle that?
question. I don't know. I've never heard of that before. So I've never seen anybody growing those tubes. If you don't, I mean, if they're so small, I don't know. It's all dependent on how many vines you have, right? Because if they're so small and you don't really see a lot of insects, then going in there and then removing, handpicking those insects would be one way of doing it. But within the grow tube, I don't know. I really don't know of any research on this case, and I would apply something to protect those vines probably early. Maybe something to apply in that case would be something like surround, like the kaolin clay, especially if you don't see the insects. Maybe that's something you can apply that will protect, like be a deterrent, right? So that could be something that people would consider. But I don't know. It's a good question. I've never seen anything in those grow tubes like this.
So at least in Minnesota, the grow tubes are fairly common. It allows growers to apply herbicides around the vines without damaging the vines, and that's the main purpose of them.
Okay.
But I guess maybe one idea is, so Japanese beetles, you know, in our area, we start seeing them beginning of July. If your weed pressure isn't that bad at that point, you could consider doing one last pre-emergent plus post-emergent herbicide application, and then removing your grow tubes, which would allow you to spray for Japanese beetles, because you're going to need to remove your grow tubes in August anyway in order for your vines to harden off for the winter. So maybe just control your weeds the best you can and get them off of there.
I was going to suggest exactly the same. I think that in the case that you have this kind of problem, and as you said, you're past, maybe the timing where you have most of your weed pressure and you've already controlled your weeds, it's about just remove them and just make sure that you're controlling just Japanese beetles. Because if you have a high infestation and you can't control them, then those vines are not going to go anywhere. They're not going to grow. You won't have enough leaves. And it's highly probable that those vines are going to be weak during the beginning of the fall, and you could get either, cold damage. So you want to make sure, again, this concept of having healthy foliage is really important, whether it's to ripen your fruit or in this case, just to establish those vines properly so that they can survive the winter. So I would agree. If you feel like you have control enough weeds and you can remove those tubes, this is the time. You're going to have to remove them anyway.
Yeah, you do want to protect those vines.
Okay, that was awesome. All right, while I'm still sharing my screen, how about this picture, Christelle? This is one that we don't see too often. in our area, right?
Yeah, so probably grapeberry moth, right? That's one that and I don't have the answer to that, unfortunately. That used to be the main pest of grapes in Wisconsin, and it's not at all anymore. So it's a very interesting because it used to be, it's still a big issue in Michigan. Why that happened, that in Wisconsin, somehow they're not here anymore. But every time I've asked grape growers in Wisconsin, who has a problem with grapeberry moth? No one. Who's monitoring for grapeberry moth? You have all the tools that you need to manage those insects. They're moths. We have pheromone traps. You have all the different strategies, and Michigan still has a lot of active research on this. There's very few people that even monitor for them. There's 3 generations per year, so you want to be paying attention if you have them. So if you're worried, if you see symptoms where you start seeing the larvae, the stung berries, like you might have a red dot or area on your berries at this time of the year, and then they start kind of webbing, and you see a lot of, you might see larvae, you might see pathogens that get into those berries that have been stung, etc., or webbing of the leaves because they protect themselves within the leaves. So they cut a section and then fold that over and web that together. If you see that, you definitely need to monitor. You definitely need to pay attention. But the likelihood of you having a heavy infestation of them in our area is really low. We really don't see them. We really don't have an issue with them. The people that have told me they monitor never apply management strategies for them. So there's insecticides, of course, that you could apply. But Annie was forwarding me a paper that was looking at economic threshold for grapeberry moth. And so what they're suggesting in that research was 10 to 20% of clusters that are damaged with grapeberry moth, again, very specific to grapeberry moth, is when you would need to apply an insecticide and you've reached economic injury level or economic threshold or action threshold. The likelihood of people having heavy infestations to the point where they see 10 to 20% of their clusters infested with grapeberry moth, I would say is really low. And Annie, I think you agree with me on that we don't see those kind of levels. You might see something like this, where yes, you might have a berry, but that's the only cluster where you see that in I don't know, 100 clusters that you're checking or something like that. Anything you want to add, Annie?
Nope. I think that hit the nail on the head. I think that was great.
I have a question. If I were a grower, I would ask this question. Is this something that we don't see a lot of this issue just because the conditions are not here or the cultivars that we grow are not favorable for the moth? Or is this something that we just delay? Like we know that with invasive species, there's this, this process that they start moving geographically until they arrive eventually to where we are. Is that the issue here? Would the growers start monitoring with the idea that this might become an issue or not really?
No, and actually, I don't recall as of the top of my head if it is, I think it might even be a native insect. So I would say no, it's not one that is going to become a pest anytime soon, as far as we can tell. It's not like it's one that just showed up. It was a pest in the past. It's still a pest in Michigan. It was a pest in the past in Wisconsin. My predecessor was saying that it was the #1 key pest of grapes in Wisconsin. And it's not at all anymore. So I think we are on the opposite end of this. And why, like I started by saying that I don't know why. I don't know why it used to be a major pest and now it's not. It's probably due to some of the pesticides we've been using, and we decreased that population really well. It could be that somehow there are biological control agents that are, somehow maintain those populations very low. We could get a resurgence of them at some point or another. That's a possibility. But really, I think that right now, it's not something that I would caution growers they should monitor and pay attention to. I would say if you see that, then if you see the damage signs that Annie was showing, or the folding of the leaves, like a little chunk that's chewed up and then that's folded over, and there's a larva in there that folded that little piece over. If you don't see any of that, I wouldn't worry about it at all. Or if your neighbor tells you, then put a monitoring trap.
Okay, so we have 2 questions in the Q&A that are related to insect pests, and then we're gonna quickly transition over to diseases because Leslie's been following along very patiently, and I'm sure people have a lot of questions about diseases as well. So real quick, these 2 questions in the chat, I'll do this one because it seems more straightforward. Every year I find a few grapevine beetles. I never worried about them. Is that a mistake? And she's got the taxonomic name in there, Pellinota punctata, perhaps. I'm not familiar with that.
I am not either. I just copied it and pasted it. I can see a picture of it. I've never seen that in grapes. I would say with any insect that you see, especially when it has in the name grapevine beetle, right? So it's possible you see it. But I would suspect that if you don't see them in high numbers, you don't have to worry about it. You're saying a few grapevine beetles, then any insect, it's the numbers that matter, right? It's not going to be, there's few that no, it's different. But for the most part, it's the numbers that will matter. So if you just see a few, I wouldn't worry about it at all. They've never been seen, as far as I know, in the Midwest as any kind of economic insect of importance, of economic importance.
All right, thanks. And then this next question, resources for insect pest management for cold climate, biodynamic or organic vineyards. Can you quickly, Christelle, just give your take on that?
But there are resources. There are some for organic vineyards from Cornell. I don't know, Leslie, if you have a chance to type that in there.
I did share it, and I don't know if I'm gonna put it in the chat also for the growers that are not, or the attendees that are not following the Q&A. Here it is. This is posted in our website. That's the 2016 Organic Guide Production from Cornell. It's for mostly vinifera, but most of it is also, I guess, applicable to cold climate grapes. And it's an entire production guide, so it's not only insects and diseases, but it also has, you know, nutrients and wood management.
I'll also just quickly throw in, they also just came out with the 2021 version of that guide. So I just put that in the chat as well. So pretty much probably the same as what Amaya just copied, but maybe if there's new registrants for organic products, there would be in this guide. So.
And what I would say too is that if you look at articles that we put together for the Wisconsin Food News, we always cover what are the cultural control practices that you can use. If there's any biocontrol, we talk about them. And we try to really hard to provide organic insecticides that you could use, at least for insects and diseases. We try to always cover the organic options as well. And cultural control practices or biocontrol work with both conventional and organic. But this is a great guide. We use it all the time.
All right, so that's a good transition over to you, Leslie. Ready to talk about diseases?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, so one thing maybe generally that, you know, I've been wondering with all this abnormally dry weather that we've been getting, how wide can a grower make their spray intervals? I mean, if it's not raining for 3 weeks and they already sprayed the last time it rained, do they need to spray again until it rains next?
You know, it's a really good question. I've definitely been getting a lot of that question this season, considering the conditions. Now, we have gotten a lot more rain in Wisconsin lately, but before we were kind of in a drought period. But typically when you see that range on your fungicide label, 7 to 14, 7 to 10, that higher end of the range, that 10-day, that 14-day, that's intended for when disease pressure is very low and conditions are not conducive. So when we think about drought, conditions are not really conducive for most of the fungal pathogens you would encounter in your vineyard. So you can stretch it out to that higher end of the range. In really prolonged situations, you do have to keep in mind that the plants are going to be stressed because of drought. Now, surely I'm sure most folks are irrigating and supplementing in that way, but the plants are still going through a different level of stress, a different kind of stress. So I would say, in addition to being able to stretch the interval to that higher end, really keep an eye on your scouting. as well, because again, if another rain comes in, that situation can really catch up with you. So I would just keep it no longer than that higher end of the interval.
Okay, thank you. So there's been some discussion that you've been part of over a couple of emails on a disease that I'll admit I hadn't heard of before. Maybe I had seen it out in the vineyard, but not known what it was. I will open that picture up here. This one. We received this from a grower on the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin last week.
Yes, so this has been a chat, I think, even beyond Wisconsin and Minnesota as of recently, but Rupestris Speckle, and it's actually, I think it's thought to be a physiological disorder, so not necessarily a pathogen being associated, but just a disorder of the plant. And you hear that Rupestris, right? So Vitis rupestris is a different species of Vitis, and so any grapes with that kind of in their background are known to occasionally have Rupestris Speckle. And so it can really vary on grapes from my understanding. It tends to kind of shift towards one side of the leaf. It usually shows up on the leaves as like little kind of brown freckles or speckles on the leaf. And in cases where your vines tend to be really stressed, let's think about drought, let's think about cold damage, or just in general weak, you're actually going to see kind of more severe Rupestris speckle. So by that, I mean, you're going to see a lot of those brown speckles start to merge or coalesce into larger areas. So if you are seeing more severe Rupestris speckle, it's oftentimes going to be on vines that are experiencing more stress for whatever reason. So it's definitely been popping up a lot lately. There's no management. Like I said, it's more kind of what has to do with the genetics of some of the hybrids that we're growing in Wisconsin and Minnesota and elsewhere. And so most of the time, from my understanding, it does not seem to have a significant impact on the vine. It obviously looks unattractive. So I completely understand the concern, but from what we understand, not a disease.
Annie, I have another picture of the Rupestris speckles, if you want me to share them so that growers can see, because this is on the underside of the leaf. I have one that you can see those more like brown.
Yeah, go ahead and share your screen.
Here it is. I don't know if growers can see there. I can make it a little bit bigger. Oh, I can move this out of here. Can you see that? This is a picture that Tim Madison shared with me, but you can see those little dots there. They're more like brown, different from, but that's a classic symptoms from these Rupestris speckles. So if you see something like this, just send us a picture, send us an email. We can look at it as well. But Leslie is right. Anything that is something like it's just stressing the vine, just abiotic stress, not necessarily. It's just like heat or cold damage or drought could just make this more prevalent.
Yeah. Go ahead, Leslie.
I was just going to add, I know for a lot of growers, initially looking at it, probably walking past in the vineyard, it does look very similar to black rot lesions that you might see in the leaves. And so remember with that, oftentimes if you have your hand lens with you, you'll be able to actually look closer into those lesions and see the fungus sporulating or producing those fruiting bodies. So that'll be a good way to differentiate. Rupestris speckle does not actually produce a fungal structure, right? Because it's not caused by fungus, whereas black rot does. So it's a good way to differentiate if you're confused. But again, also send us pictures.
Okay. I was gonna say too that maybe this is just reiterate the point you just made, that it's important to send pictures or sometimes even submit a sample to the lab, because I could see how that could be mistaken for potentially like nutrient deficiency or even phytotoxicity. I mean, especially if you're not familiar with the disease and seen it a lot, I can see how that could be confused easily. There's a question in the Q&A. I love this question. When it comes to the management of first and second leaf, meaning non-bearing vines, new vines, what's the current recommendation regarding fungicide usage? Can we get away with few or even no applications? Or will this lead to a buildup of inoculum for the following season?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I've heard either way on this. I think my best advice to you is I think, yeah, you still need to manage, right? Because you don't want anything to overwinter down the line, but that level of care can be a little bit different compared to when you have fruit. So I guess what I mean by that is you don't need to put the best, most expensive fungicides on those plants during the growing season. If you've got some other ones that get the job done, maybe not as robust as the ones you'd use once your plants are starting to bear, that's a fine way to manage those grapes before you're actually starting to get fruit. So
Awesome. And then Leslie, in general, this season, since it's been so much drier than normal, have you been seeing, less disease out there, or just different relative densities of disease species?
yeah, so let's say, so initially, like coming back from Wisconsin, and we do scout the Madison, Wisconsin vineyards. For weeks, we weren't seeing much of anything. And I'd say within the recent couple of weeks with the rain and then really the humidity, I think is what kicked things off because it was pretty hot and dry. But with recent humidity, recent rain, we've actually seen a pretty significant takeoff and powdery mildew. And so again, that's on pretty susceptible varieties like Brianna, for instance. We know Brianna is just, it's highly susceptible to powdery mildew. So we're seeing that on berries, we're seeing that on rake, we're seeing that on the leaves as well. So I'd say that one has taken off. We typically see black rot, but nothing too concerning in terms of the density in the canopy. But I would say powdery mildew has really picked
up. Okay, thanks. Okay, one more short disease thing, and then we forgot to talk about one of my favorite pests. So we'll get back to that in a second. Okay, so this photo. This is one, it came up kind of blurry on my screen because it's such a large screen. So hopefully this looks kind of clear to you. This is something that I was out at a big vineyard in Minnesota about 2 weeks ago, and we were seeing a lot of this. It's these necrotic brown, crispy spots on the edges of leaves. They're kind of a random shape and they have this kind of yellow halo around them. And at first I thought, oh, well, maybe that's just some leftover leaf necrosis from frost. I didn't think anything of it until the grower told me that he's been experiencing this in the same part of his vineyard for 3 years. And so, then there's more red flags. So I emailed some plant pathologist at the the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And she told me, oh, that's actually something that we are interested in monitoring. Because this symptom where you've got this irregular spot of dieback on the edge of the leaf with the yellow halo around it, which is key, that yellow halo has to be there. She said that it could be one of two diseases of concern that the Department of Ag is trying to keep track of, because the more they can learn about how common it is in our region, the more we can develop recommendations for how to control it. So it's to our benefit if we help each other understand how widespread it is. So basically the ask from the Minnesota Department of Ag is, if you see this, just let us know. You can let Extension know, let Leslie know, let me know, depending on what state you're in, that you might have something like this and we can check it out. So just as an FYI, the two diseases that it might be are angular leaf spot or something called rotobrenner, but I wouldn't get yourself too concerned about the impacts of the disease right now. It's mainly foliar disease, and very rarely seems to affect fruit. Anything to add on that?
I think the only thing I'll add, and of course, keep an eye on that, especially Wisconsin growers. If that comes up for you, please feel free to contact me. Happy to take a look at any photos to help kind of diagnose. But Annie brought up a good point talking about that halo kind of that we're seeing around that lesion. Oftentimes when we think about these different physiological disorders versus biotic or diseases caused by pathogens, sometimes that halo can be a good distinguishing factor, not all the time. So just as you're starting to look at things like with Phomopsis leaf spots, we often see a little yellow halo. Initially, we see just yellow initial spots for downy mildew. So some of these things can start to guide what you're seeing in terms of diagnosing on the actual leaf surfaces.
Okay, thanks. All right, so the next pest has to do it, it kind of intersects insect and disease management. We had a whole webinar having to do with this last year by Megan Hall around this time of year, if you might remember, is SWD and sour rot. So maybe we can start with Christelle. We know SWD, spotted wing Drosophila, is out now. It's our trapping in Minnesota has found that it's out there in all of our trapping sites. That's common for this time of year. It usually starts being seen around the end of June and continues through the rest of the season. But Christelle, when do grape growers really need to start worrying about SWD?
Okay, so there's two parts, and you alluded to that at the beginning, right? There's the first part of what's the impact of spotted wing Drosophila by itself on our cold climate grapes. So I'll start with that. What we've seen with wine grape cultivars, the cold climate grapes, is that this is a fly that can cut the skin of the fruit in general, and they cut the skin of ripe and ripening fruit. They cannot cut the skin of wine cold climate grapes. We've done extensive lab assays. They are not able to cut the skin. We tested only 6 or 7 cultivars, but we also had something like 8 different cultivars that we assessed in the field for larval infestation, and had very, very low larval infestation in all the cultivars we tested in the field, like less than 1 larva per fruit or per gram of fruit. It wasn't even per fruit, so very, very small. And then in the lab, they could not infest a single one of those sound grapes. So our recommendation from a standpoint of just the damage that spotted wing Drosophila can cause to our cold climate grapes, and wine grapes only, I'm not talking about table grapes, because there are some like Somerset that seem to be more susceptible. But when we talk about the wine cold climate grapes, our recommendation is really just check fruit for larvae inside. Do not spray it because you're seeing flies out there, because the flies are there, and they're not just spotted wing Drosophila. You're going to have your Drosophila melanogaster that are very actively present in your vineyards, and so are they in your kitchen. So they're everywhere. These flies are ubiquitous, the melanogaster especially. So we do not recommend to spray because you see flies. They cannot infest your ripe fruit, let alone your green fruit. So right now is not a time to be spraying for your Drosophila, whatever Drosophila they are. Only spotted wing could and can't cut the skin of the fruit. The other cannot do that. But even spotted wing Drosophila cannot infest, is not interested in infesting green fruit. So now is not the time at all. That's talking just about the impact of spotted wing Drosophila and Drosophila in general on grapes. When it comes to the association of spotted wing Drosophila and Drosophila melanogaster with cluster rot, then there's that whole webinar that Annie mentioned, where yes, indeed, those Drosophila flies have been associated with carrying the pathogens for cluster rot. But that would also be something that happens once your fruit is already compromised. Then any fly is fair game, is going to be fruit and transmit pathogens at the same time. But the research from Megan Hall has shown that if you control flies at the time where the fruit becomes susceptible to cluster rot, you can decrease by controlling. It's not the vector, it's one of the vector of the pathogens. It's not the only one. Spotted wing Drosophila, Drosophila melanogaster. You also have kind of abiotic factors that may move those pathogens around, or other vectors. At that time, yes, it will help in controlling the flies to control the cluster rot, or sour rot. I'm sorry, I keep saying cluster instead of sour rot. But that's not something you would do if you do not have symptoms of sour rot or a history of sour rot. Hope that makes sense to people. And Leslie or Annie, feel free to add to that, but I would recommend to watch the webinar if you have that issue.
Yeah, and the time when the clusters become susceptible to sour rot, Megan talked about that in the webinar. It was a certain Brix, and we're very, very far from it now. It was something like 13 or 16 Brix is when you need to start looking out for sour rot and then start controlling for it. Leslie, Do you remember, what some of those recommendations were? Once you actually get to that point, what do you spray?
I know that there's tank mixes with insecticides for Drosophila, I think at that time. Off the top of my head, I'd have to check the Midwest guide. I can and follow up. But yeah, that is the time that you're trying to manage. And ahead of that, if that's an issue that you've had in the past or concerned about, is really just trying to protect the berry from getting damaged, right? As Christelle was saying, they're not actually, these just flies aren't getting in the berry. It's birds, it's whatever else is causing damage to your berry. And even on top of that, if your berries have been impacted by something like powdery mildew really severely prior to veraison, that's going to weaken them and make them more susceptible to something like a botrytis or a sour rot. So,
and at that time, you're going to have to pay very much attention to your pre-harvest intervals, right? And so the number of products that you can apply at that time for flies are going to be very limited. So I would say if you're looking at controlling flies very close to harvest at that time, when the Brix is already getting pretty high and you're soon to harvest, would be some kind of a pyrethroids, or even Exorol is one, I think. I would have to double check, I'm sorry, what's labeled on Grape. So off the top of my head, I can't remember, but something like Mustang Max or Exorol is one. I mean, there's several insecticides in the pyrethroids that you can apply, even in the organophosphates that would have good activity. I wouldn't apply any kind of neonicotinoid on spotted wing Drosophila because those don't work. And then for organic growers, Entrust spinosad is really the one that you would want to be applying. That's the only one that has a strong efficacy for spotted wing. That will be registered on grapes. And then if you needed to do a second application, then you could go with something like Pyganic, for example, the pyrethrin. So that would be the recommendation.
Okay. And then with sour rot, Megan was recommending doing a tank mix of the insecticide with one of the products was oxidate. And oxidate is what it does is it dries up the berries that have been infected by sour rot or have been damaged by, let's say, bird feeding or splitting. So using both the insecticide and the oxidate together was found to be more effective on sour rot than just using the oxidate on its own, because the fruit flies are a vector of that disease and helps the disease actually get into the berry. Okay, we're almost out of time. So I think that's great. We didn't get to all the photos, but I think we got to the highest priority ones. The others I was going to show are just herbicide damage and what looks to be sunburn. Maybe I'll just share this photo of sunburn real quick. Okay, so this is something that can be confused for hail damage, of course. So if you see some what looks like rotting or shriveling on the berries, but you don't see any signs of clear disease and the berries are clearly not ripe yet, then think about, has it hailed recently? Or think about, do you have clusters that are strongly exposed to the sun? Did you just do really drastic leaf pulling? Because if you do really late leaf pulling, that sudden shock of the clusters being exposed to a lot more sun than they're used to can cause some sunburn. So just think about the context clues and what's been going on. But both hail and sunburn are things that cause damage that can be examples of how sour rot or fruit flies can get into those grapes once they actually start ripening. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us in this discussion today, and thanks everyone for the questions that you submitted. If you have additional questions for us, we shared both of the newsletters, the University of Minnesota Fruit and Veg News, as well as the Wisconsin Fruit News. We post weekly articles on both of those newsletters, and there's some really good stuff for grape growers on there, so check those out and subscribe. If you're in Wisconsin, contact one of these Wisconsin folks, and if you're in Minnesota, contact me, and we will help you out and get you some answers.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks much, Annie, for leading us into this.
All right, thank you, and we will send you the webinar recording when it's posted. Thanks.
Yeah, I share there in the chat, and Annie, I know that you can also share one for Minnesota where the recording for this webinar will be posted.
Yeah, I'll just share mine in the email because I don't want to bring it up right now. But... All right.
That's good. Thank you, Annie.
Have a great week. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.